I'm just going to give you the floor.
Okay. Well, welcome to another exciting Honors College Diversity Series lecture. I feel like I do these like every month. It's like a monthly show or something. But I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Dr. Clement. My usual special shout out to Marla Gladstone and others who helped organize all my lectures for this school year. Tonight's topic is navigating the afterlife, what happens when we die. My name is Dr. Aaron Gale. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at WVU. And I have a lot of slides tonight to get through. And I realized one thing, and I have to admit this to Dean Clement and others. As I was writing this lecture the last few days, I tried to do way too much in this lecture. So I probably should have taken like one or two topics. But ideally, what I wanted to cover and what I hope to cover, and I don't know if we'll get through everything, is we wanted to talk about like what happens when we die, which is a vast topic unto itself. And then I said, okay, well, we'll do Egypt, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That's like an entire course. So basically tonight, if you're at this webinar, it's like, we're doing a whole course in like 1 hour. So I don't have as many pictures as I usually do. I only have a couple pictures. So I have about 15 slides. So we're going to roll through fairly quickly. And again, afterlife is afterlife as in resurrection, afterlife is in immortality, afterlife is like what happens to your body, afterlife is like where does your soul go. So I'm sort of had to, as I did this lecture, I sort of had to pick and choose from different religions what I did. So by no means is this any sort of comprehensive lecture. So that being said, afterlife and resurrection is the norm. The question of what happens when we die is one that has plagued humankind for centuries. And I do remember this. I was lying in my parents' bedroom. My father was reading the newspaper as he would usually do after work. And I remember when I was a little boy, I don't know, maybe 8, 9 years old, I asked my father, I'm like, Dad, like, what happens when we die? And I remember him responding almost verbatim. He said something along the lines of, I don't know. No one's ever come back to tell us, which was a great answer. I mean, sort of a semi-avoidant, but, a great answer. And I do miss my father dearly. Both of my parents have been gone since the 1990s. So I do miss them greatly. But the point is well taken. No one's really come back to give us an explanation. Paranormal stuff aside, we're not going to get into that tonight. But what really does happen when we die sort of remains a mystery. Yet, major religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam discuss the topic of death and afterlife at length in both scripture and tradition. And that is an important point to make because not everything is in scripture. Some things have been left up to interpretation and tradition as the centuries have passed. So it's valid to say both scripture and tradition. But as a historian, yes, I'm a professor of religious studies for, about 25 years now, but I'm not a theologian. I'm more a historian. I always make sure people know who I am and who I'm not. I'm not a theologian. I don't claim to be a great theologian. I've read enough theologians to last me a lifetime in undergrad and grad school, took whole courses on theologians, but I'm a historian and I did archaeology for several seasons in Israel, at least part of seasons. So as a historian, I feel it necessary to dig a little bit deeper. First, hey, it's what archaeologists do, it's what we do. So in a nutshell, before we get to Judaism, the first of the historically of the three major monotheistic faiths, I have to say this, that in the ancient world, we're talking 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Most ancient civilizations really honestly had little use for the afterlife. Death just sort of brought you to a shadowy place. You slept. Maybe there was an underworld or afterworld that really wasn't talked about a lot. Why is that? My theory as a historian is one of the reasons why the afterlife was not emphasized a whole lot is, let's face it, in the ancient world, life was short, difficult, and hard enough every day. You weren't, as I sort of semi-facetiously tell my students, you weren't worried about, afterlife or going to Disneyland when you died or anything like that. Everyday life was tough. Maybe you lived 30, 35 years at best. If you had 5 kids, 3 or 4 of them would never make it to adulthood. Trying to find food every day. Everybody was subsistence, agrarian, basically. Life was hard enough, and it was a very present-centered world, at least in ancient Near East. For the most part, it was fairly present-centered. Even the great Mesopotamian, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, modern day Iraq way, where some of the greatest early civilizations lived. They didn't have a whole lot of use for the afterlife, not like we do today. Death just brought you, as I said, to kind of a shadowy place where you slept. Even the ancient Hebrews. So let's travel back, about 3,000 years. Ancient Judaism, the origins of Judaism, the ancient Hebrews. Even they did not seemingly have much use for an afterlife, at least not until later. Judaism, of course, would develop, as we're going to learn tonight, would develop a fairly sophisticated belief in the afterlife. But if you read the early Hebrew scriptures and stuff, the book of Exodus and things like that, you don't see Moses talking about, hey, am I going to go to heaven or hell when I die? What happens to my soul? It's not mentioned at all, basically. In the ancient Jewish world or Hebrew world, basically death just brought one to a place called Sheol. It's like a place of shadows, a place where you just slept. And I'll say more about that when we get to Judaism. There are examples of Sheol in the Hebrew scriptures. So I have a few quotes here. The Psalms talk about, Psalm 86 talks about, you delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. So it doesn't say you were judged. It doesn't say it's heaven. It doesn't say it's hell. It's just you delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. The prophet Ezekiel, out of the midst of Sheol. And of course, there's the other example in the book of Job about just, kill me and send me to Sheol already. So Sheol was kind of one of the origins in Judaism of where you went, but it's not the heaven or hell as we think of it today. And I'll say more about that. But first, let's take a quick trip to Egypt. The one big exception of culture in the ancient Near Eastern world regarding things like an afterlife 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, would definitely be ancient Egypt. It's ancient and modern Israel's neighbor did discuss the afterlife some 3,000 plus years ago. In fact, the Egyptians almost seemed obsessed with the afterlife. As you probably already know, in addition to great civilizations in Mesopotamia, in Egypt their culture was very advanced militarily, religiously, economically. Some argue that Egypt was one of the first, if not the first culture to have written texts. Sumeria, Mesopotamia is the other big candidate. We're not sure in the Near East who wrote first, but Egypt is a great candidate. So Egyptian civilization was very advanced. And what was really cool about Egyptian civilization was the people's belief that everything was alive. There were no its in Egypt. Everything was alive. Everything had a gender, kind of like some languages today. German, Greek, everything, even nouns are gendered. Everything's sort of like alive. Everything has a life to it. In Egypt, they didn't really have a word much for it. It was pretty much everything was alive. So the worst thing in the world, the whole goal in Egypt was you wanted to live. And I'm not sure why I'm getting shadowy here. I'm on a new video camera here, so I apologize but don't watch me, watch the PowerPoint anyway. You're not missing much. Look at me, trust me. So the worst thing in the world then in Egypt was if you ceased to exist, to stop living. Everything was alive. You wanted to remain alive forever. You never wanted to die. And so for Egypt, then, it's probably not a secret that the people believed that the end of the earthly life was just that. It was just your end of one journey. You had way more journeys to go after your human body died. It's also another reason why mummification was there and things like that, because they never really wanted to believe that you were going to be forever dead. You wanted to remain alive. Hence, as we see in the next slide here, this is a picture from a museum, I think in Sweden, in Stockholm. It's an actual snippet from the Book of the Dead. So in Egypt, for example, they even came up with what is famously known today as the Book of the Dead, where they even had guides basically for how to navigate the afterworld when you died. The end of the human body was just, the end of one journey. You moved on to another journey. And as this slide shows, this is a papyrus snippet. The Book of the Dead was a huge papyrus-like scroll. And this was just one snippet of it. You can see the person lying there. You can see their body, being carried probably down the Nile River onto its next journey. It was just going to have another journey. So Egypt represented then that one exception as far as afterlife goes. They really did sort of obsess over it. Now, let me say this. Not everybody had a Book of the Dead. Not every Book of the Dead was identical. I'm going to shut my window behind me here because people are cutting their lawn and I don't know if you can hear that. There we go. Of course, my next door neighbors, when I'm doing this presentation, all decided to get out their lawnmower and start cutting the lawn. I cut mine on Sunday. But anyway, not everyone could afford a Book of the Dead. Remember, in the ancient world, there was no printing press. You had to pay a scribe to write this stuff. So you had to have money. So the Book of the Dead was largely for the privileged and for those who had the money. But you could literally buy a guidebook to teach you spells, tell you where to go, what to look out for as you navigated the realm of the afterworld. And along with that, then ultimately, Egypt even came up with the concept of final judgment. If you look on courthouse buildings and stuff, you'll sometimes see those scales of justice or whatever on the side of government buildings. That sort of traces its roots back to ancient Egypt. For the Egyptians believed, as I said, that death was just the beginning of a different journey, really to a place of final judgment. Ultimately, what would happen to you if you navigated the afterworld correctly is you'd come to like a final hall where there would literally kind of be like a scale of justice there. And it was overseen by the ancient pharaohs, Anubis, Osiris, the great god Osiris, as well as Ma'at, the goddess of justice, whose feather of justice was placed on a scale. So the two scales, you'd place kind of like a scarab, which would represent your heart. That was the center of the life. And on the other scale would be the feather of justice. And the whole goal was not to have one outweigh the other. Whether you lived, the perfect life or not perfect life, you wanted the scales to be balanced. You wanted everything to balance. If that was the case and you lived a balanced life and your life was balanced, the person would go to paradise, sort of a paradise-like place, and live forever. However, if the scales were uneven, then you would be devoured by like this nasty beast of a goddess named Ammit, sometimes called Amut. So you would be eaten, and that could be the worst thing that could happen to you, because then you would cease to exist. And in Egypt, it was all about living. So Egypt represents that one ancient culture that was the exception, that they believed. And here's a picture of an image of the goddess Ammit. The hind end is like a hippopotamus. The front quarter is like a lion, and the top is like a crocodile. So sort of a three-faceted, nasty goddess who would devour you if your judgment was uneven, if you did not live a proper life of balance. So then, of course, came the Jews. Judaism as it evolved. As we said earlier, Judaism initially didn't talk a lot about the afterlife and, what happened to you when you died. Just kind of went to Sheol and you basically slept. But eventually, Judaism was conquered by many other cultures, the Persians, the Greeks, you name it, the Assyrians, you name it, a bunch of cultures, and especially the Persians and the Greeks were very influential. Even if you don't like your invaders, even if you're invaded by foreign conquerors like the Jews were, the history of Judaism in the ancient world is just the history of conquerors. Let's call it for what it is. Jews in ancient Palestine, ancient Israel, rarely if ever were autonomous. It was very rare. Most of the time they were conquered. And no one likes to be conquered. But even if you don't like your conquerors, it doesn't mean they don't influence you. in particular, the Greek culture. When Alexander the Great made his way through the Middle East around 332, before the Common Era, about 2,300 years ago, Jews loved Greek culture. No, nobody likes being invaded again. But they loved Greek culture. And as we know, the Persians with Zoroastrianism and the Greeks with their language, with Hades, with a lot of the words we use today, and a lot of the concepts about afterlife and final judgment, even resurrection, things like that. That was sort of probably adopted into Judaism. And it's not a secret then that the later Hebrew scriptures and even later Jewish texts that did not make it into the Bible, all of a sudden, after the exposure to the Persians and Greeks, we start to see little inklings of talk of afterlife and final judgment and things like that. It begins to slowly permeate its way into Jewish thought, that there is something that happens when you die beyond sleeping. And as I noted a few minutes ago, we never read about Moses worrying about heaven or hell in the book of Exodus or anything like that. But once later texts are written, the book of Daniel and things like that, some of the final texts, all of a sudden we start to see more inklings of afterlife, great final battles, what the heavens, and things like that. One of the very earliest references to life after death in the Hebrew scriptures may be found in 1 Samuel, where the famous Samuel is conjured up after his death for kind of like advice and soothsaying by the tormented King Saul. That's one of the rare, like, early instances of a reference to like something related to the afterlife in Hebrew scriptures, because it's generally not there early on. So to continue, so Judaism developed beliefs concerning the immortal soul and what happens when we die. However, even the Torah, even the Hebrew scriptures themselves did not fully explain a lot of stuff, at least some stuff. So even after the Bible was sort of finished, the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, whatever you want to call it, the Torah, the rabbis, the early Jewish leaders, 2,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago, 1,600 years ago, they also began to talk about the afterlife and clarify what the scriptures sort of didn't flesh out. They started to talk about concepts, for example, like the Olam Haba, the world to come, and things like that, a place where the soul would eventually migrate to after you died. So now all of a sudden, in the later Hebrew scriptures and in the era of the rabbis, we're suddenly now starting to talk about the immortal soul. The final judgment is more pronounced. The world to come, Gan Eden, this Garden of Eden, this like paradise kind of place that represented probably early thoughts of heaven, kind of like the spiritual Garden of Eden, if you will, Gan Eden. Sort of a waiting area, maybe. Maybe it's not the permanent paradise. And eventually, the concept of the Shamayim, the heavens, sort of becomes normative in Jewish thought, where when your soul dies, your soul has to sort of be purged of its sins in sort of a purgatory-like place called Gehenna. And then ultimately, hopefully within a year or so, the soul would migrate onto the Olam Haba, the world to come. Notice in this slide that I did not say anything about hell or the devil. Hell and the devil are two concepts in Judaism which really exist more in the realm of legend, stories, than it does normative everyday Jewish beliefs. The concept of hell is not something that is taught typically in most synagogues or places like that. That's more a Christian-Islamic concept. So hell and devil are a little bit murkier. In the Hebrew scriptures, in fact, the word devil, it's a Greek word. Satan or Satan is the Hebrew word. The word Satan is used very sparsely in the Hebrew scriptures. And when it is used, it does not refer to a devil. It usually refers to either a generic person or it refers to an angel. So the concept of hell and devil, that's something that sort of exists. Yes, it's talked about by the rabbis here and there, but it more exists in the realm of Jewish legend than it does everyday thought. So ultimately then, what do Jews believe? What's going to happen? We know what happens when we die. Your soul's hopefully going to make its way to Olam Haba. I mean, that's great. What else happens eventually after you die? Ultimately, Jews believe that the Messiah will come to earth and usher in a new era where the enemies of the Jews will be vanquished. That's fairly typical messianic thought, not just in Judaism, but in, to some extent in Christianity and Islam as well. However, the big difference between Christian Islamic beliefs and Judaism is Jesus does not play any role in the end times, any role in anything. Jesus, as I teach my students for 20 years or so, since I've been teaching world religions, Jesus has no function in Judaism. So no Trinity, no Son of God, no Jesus Messiah, no second coming, nothing like that. Ultimately, then, what does happen? Well, the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah to come. The word Messiah comes from Hebrew. It means Mashiach. It means like an anointed one, which is originally kings were anointed ones. So kings were originally Mashiachs, Messiahs. Ultimately, though, there are other beliefs about the afterlife in Judaism. For example, literal resurrection of the dead and final judgment. The first inklings of final judgment begin to be seen in some earlier Hebrew texts, like the prophet Isaiah, maybe 2,700 years ago or so, but it eventually develops much further. Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19 states, your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. Daniel also talks about it, saying, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. This seems to refer to a literal bodily resurrection. Some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, the word hell is not used. The idea of everlasting torment is not typically something very Jewish. Daniel was sort of risque saying that, being that it's a biblical book. But nonetheless, the general belief is in Judaism, there will be a literal resurrection of the body. There will be a final judgment. Everybody's called into account for their deeds. And then the righteous, and maybe those who aren't so righteous, will enter the Olam Haba. But the idea, the world to come. But the idea is not really revolving around it's all heaven or it's all hell and eternal torment with the devil. It's just not really part of the thinking. It's kind of like the maybe more questionable character you are. You're just like get the cheap seats in the back of the stadium, so to speak, in the Olam Haba. You don't get to sit in the box seats or anything. That's kind of your estrangement from God. The farther you're away from God in the Shemayim, in the heaven, that's kind of your punishment unto itself. So that's Judaism. Enter Christianity. It's hardly surprising that Christianity would pick up on a lot of these Jewish themes, since the first Christians were Jews themselves. But as we well know now, many of us now know, Christianity added a lot of unique and rich material to the mix, including things like original sin, Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah, Trinity, and so forth. Regarding the Messiah, the followers of Jesus came to believe that he was indeed the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, although perhaps not the one that many Jews had been expecting, which is why most Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah. He didn't fulfill. He did not vanquish Israel's enemies. He didn't vanquish the Romans, in his case, 2,000 years ago. But along with that came a whole new understanding of salvation, soteriology, if you will, the study of being saved. The idea that Jesus died on the cross for the forgiveness of humankind's sins, thus ensuring one's place in heaven after death. So along with that then also went concepts like immortality of the soul, final judgment, and so forth, stuff that we'd already seen in Judaism. So I'm not going to review everything now. I'm just trying to go over some unique and interesting concepts. So much then of the view of the afterlife and what happens when we die in Christianity began to center around Jesus' earthly life as well as his own afterlife as the risen Christ. And we see that we see some of these themes being portrayed. Christians looking back at the Hebrew scriptures, like this passage from Isaiah chapter 53 that I have, the suffering servant motif. Jesus was the symbolic, sacrificial lamb. and things like that. He represented the misunderstood Messiah. No, he's not the Messiah that's going to vanquish Rome, but he's the Messiah that's going to vanquish our sins. He's the Messiah that conquered death, that type of thinking. And that ingrained itself into Christian beliefs about the afterlife, that salvation came through Jesus. You could be saved through faith in Jesus. And of course, the first Christian writer, St. Paul, spells that out verbatim in some of his letters, including the epistle to the Romans. One question some people do say is resurrection, even the risen Jesus, is that actually human resurrection event, or is that pure spirit? That we'll say for another time, but it is still sort of debated. So ultimately then, Christianity's culmination. Like the Jews, Christians believe that this should be the immortal, well, it should be probably the mortal body, was subject to death and final judgment, but they added a lot of concepts. As I noted a few minutes earlier, Judaism, really not a lot of normative talk about death, but in Christian thought, the devil also becomes linked to the afterlife as sort of this, and the before afterlife, the living life, the material world, as sort of the tempter that lurks around trying to steal your soul, trying to con you into doing bad things. And we see this portrayed in the Gospels. The first Gospel, Matthew, has at the beginning of chapter 4, where Jesus himself faced temptations. Satan, by this time, or the devil, is now a literal entity. And as I said a few minutes ago, he's really only an angel at best in the Hebrew scriptures. So Christianity then, in addition to adding things like hell, Satan, the devil, Christianity adopted the belief that the risen Jesus will return at the end times to sort of finish what he started. I mean, I had a professor who said, I'm talking mention the book of Revelation next, so it always reminds me of the late Dr. Kelly, may rest in peace. He just died recently. As my professor always said, the book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian scriptures, he said, what is that book all about? I know it's about great final battles and this, that, and the other, but he said, really, his view was it really sort of finishes explaining why Jesus came to earth and what's going to happen when he comes again. It's just kind of like this sort of the part two of like why Jesus came to earth in the first place. It's very, very, very interesting, very well put. But other things in the book of Revelation, of course, is the scenario of this great final battle. Everybody's sort of got to be on the right team, and the establishment of this new Jerusalem after Satan or the devil's ultimate defeat. You can read about that in Revelation chapter 21. The most important thing then the Christian needed to do was, of course, have faith in Jesus, be on the right team, live the good Christian life. Because at the end, yes, there will be an end times. You will be liable to judgment. Yes, the soul is immortal. Jesus is sort of your advocate, if you will, for salvation. And so a lot of the Jewish themes are still there, but Christianity really added its own ingredients to the mix, if you will, to the recipe, and really made it a very rich tapestry of afterlife thoughts. Things like purgatory are still debated by various Christian denominations. Catholicism, long being an advocate of the idea that the immortal soul must be purified after death before finishing the journey to heaven. Not all Christian denominations, of course, share that belief. I'm not an expert in modern Christian denominations, so we're just going to leave that there. But hell essentially became the devil's realm, where the dead may be tormented, and that is very, very graphically portrayed about 1,000 years ago in Dante's famous Inferno, where he has all his enemies and everybody he ever didn't like in Italy and beyond. Dante was Italian, and beyond, he just put him in hell being tormented for the most part. So that was Christianity then, this rich tapestry of thought about afterlife, resurrection, final judgment. But now Jesus is inserted into the equation. The devil's inserted into the equation. Hell's more inserted into the equation. There's just more ingredients in the pot now. By the time we get to Islam, Islam confirms a lot of Judeo-Christian stuff, so I just don't want to repeat it. But I wanted to give just a brief outline then of where does Islam stand in relation to other monotheistic faiths. Here, I mean Judaism and Christianity. Islam confirms Muslims believe that divine revelation had been given to the Jews and Christians previously. Muslims acknowledge the Gospels, they acknowledge the Torah, things like that, the Psalms of David. But over time, the correct divine revelation, the original divine revelation given to guys like Jesus and Moses, it became corrupted. It became kind of like a huge game of telephone, where by the time you get to the last person, the message isn't the same as it was with the first person. And thus, Muslims believe then that the Quran, sacred scripture for the Muslims, represented the true corrected version of divine revelation given by the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad about 1400 years ago or so, over a period of about 22 years. And Islam in the Quran, which is God's divine revelation really to humankind, advocated for the strong nature of Allah, or God, the Arabic word for God, Allah, and Jesus had a role, but not the divine Son of God. There is no Trinity in Islam. There's no original sin in Islam. There's no belief that God had a family in Islam or had a kid, had a son. And there are some passages there. Surah means kind of like chapter in the Quran. You can read chapter 10, chapter 17, chapter 19. It clearly states Allah didn't really need a family or anything like that. So that's just a quick background on Islam and kind of where it's coming from. So Islam then in the afterlife and the Messiah. Jesus does have a function in Islam as sort of a savior, kind of like a Messiah, but it's kind of a different story. Muslims believe that Jesus never died on the cross. It was someone else in his place. So he never died. So at the end times, as the end times approach, Jesus will return to earth to help establish true Islam on earth and will slay the Dajjal, kind of like an antichrist or false Messiah. Then Jesus will finally die. So Jesus is not going to live forever. Jesus did not die on the cross or anything like that. He's not the Son of God. It's kind of a different role. It's very significant. Jesus is a prophet in Islam. He's one of the 5 prophets of power in Islam, but not a Son of God thing. And Muslims, kind of like Jews and Christians, believe in a Messiah. The Mahdi will eventually come after a series of signs and will also help establish true Islam on earth at the end times and establish Islam. In the meantime, okay, so what kind of life should we live? What happens when we die in Islam? In the meantime, it is the job of all Muslims to live the best they can be. Even though the Quran itself states the human soul is enjoined to evil. This resonates the nature of the human condition. Islam acknowledges, like Judaism, like Christianity, that humankind, we're not perfect. We are mortal. We are going to die. We are going to make mistakes. There are repercussions for our mistakes. There are ways to atone for our mistakes, and the responsibility lies with us. So in essence, humans are given a limited time on earth to do what is right and forbid what is wrong. And that's right out of the Quran there, chapter 31, verse 17. So from there then, okay, so what happens when you die? Muslims believe that this world is essentially a testing ground. And I don't think Jews or Christians would really argue with that. I think we're kind of sort of on the same page, that we're tested in this world for what will happen after we die. I mean, it's sort of a testing ground. The former imam at the local mosque here used to teach Islam for me in the program for religious studies. And he used to say that in his class. And, you know, when he taught, he used to say, hey, I'm not worried about fasting during Ramadan, which just ended. I'm not worried about fasting during Ramadan. I'm not worried about doing this stuff. This world's just a testing ground. So what? I fast during the day, during the month of Ramadan. Big deal. It's no big deal to me. This world's just a testing world anyway. It's not the ultimate be-all, end-all of our existence. In Judaism, we would say it's not the Olam Haba. It's not the world to come. There's something else coming. So that sort of sets the path that Muslims believe that there is something after death. In fact, even when you die, even in the grave, according to tradition, angels begin to question one. Okay, your earthly body's dead. Your soul is not. They begin to question one regarding the topics of religion, prophets, and God. What kind of life did you live? What did you do? What do you believe? What do you believe? So already really final judgment in Islam, it starts in the grave. It's sort of already being initiated. Humankind will eventually be judged during the day of judgment at the end times. Most religions believe that The time of final judgment happens like in a messianic area, the end times. And in Islam, there's even a tradition that says the final day of judgment can be 50,000 years long. That's how important it is. That's a big deal. That's how massive final judgment is in Islam, that it can last for 50,000 years. You are held accountable for your deeds on earth, especially in not just your acts, which I mean, Allah, Muslims believe that Allah already knows everything that's going to happen. You can't trick God. You can't say, haha, God didn't know I was going to catch that football. Haha, God didn't know I was going to make 2 steps to the right. You can't do that. So in Islam, one of the big keys then, as far as humans go, is not even necessarily the action's important, but not the even so the action. It's the intent of the action. What was your intent behind the action you did? That's where a great measure of free will is for Muslims. But you are judged for your deeds, the intent of your act, and only Allah, only God can judge you. No human has the authority to ultimately judge someone else. When I teach world religions, it's a point that I make in the classroom every semester when we do our unit on Islam, is that you don't have the authority to judge someone else. Only Allah can truly judge humankind. So you can't say, I saw that person take a wallet. That means that they're going to burn in hell. See, I know that. How do you know? The example I use in my class is, how do you know that if after class you see somebody grab my wallet off a desk after class? You say, he's a thief. He stole my wallet. How dare you? You stole my wallet. How do you know that person wasn't going to run down the hall and give the wallet back to me or turn it into lost and found? You know, you don't know what ultimately happens. And in Islam, only Allah then has the ultimate ability to judge. And one can either be sentenced to Jannah, to paradise, or Jahannam, the hellfires. There is hell in Islam. So Muslims believe in the concept of heaven and hell, like Christians, but somewhat unlike Jews who do not, as we said, normatively embrace the concept of hell. Even if you are getting a final judgment, and there's all sorts of legends about how that happens. Some say you'll receive a book of deeds, and if you receive the book of deeds in your left hand or behind your back, that means you're bad, you're going to the hellfires. If you receive the book of deeds in your right hand or in front of you, that means you're going to Jannah. But even if you are going to Jannah, there's a tradition that says you have to cross over a bridge to enter paradise, to enter like this paradise. And the legend says that it's as thin as a hair and sharp as a razor. So you want to be super duper good so you can like get across that bridge as fast as you can. Your good deeds, in other words, are kind of the fuel to propel you across that bridge. You can go slow and it can be painful, even going to Jannah, or you can go fast. So you are constantly in Islam held accountable for your deeds. And that leads us to resurrection. When we are judged, is it a bodily resurrection? Most likely in Islam, the answer is yes, but different theories are out there. The Quran, once again, seems to indicate that the bodily resurrection in the end times, when you will be judged, is, it says in the Quran, chapter 7, you will return to him just as he created you. The Quran also discusses the eyes, ears, and skin if one enters the hellfires. So it seems to be a literal portrayal of the body being resurrected after you die at the time of judgment. So it seems to be a physical event. So being that I've gone about 40 minutes, I'm going to stop and save time for questions, but I do have one final slide. Tattoos. This is a question I sometimes get asked from my students. What's the deal then? If the body is going to be resurrected intact, where does that leave the idea of tattoos? Especially, I know you can undo tattoos now and have laser removal and stuff, but you know, if you're getting a permanent tattoo, you're getting your skin physically marked. Is that a desecration of God's creation? I think technically for Jews, probably the answer is no tattoos. Muslims probably no as well. In Judaism, it seems to be fairly cut and dry. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 28, it says, you shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead or tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. So Judaism, it seems to be no go on tattoos. I've had students ask me, hey, I'm Jewish. Can I get a tattoo? The technical answer is if you follow this precept, the answer would be no, but I know it's debated. it's a more modern issue among various religions. But I just wanted to see if the body is being resurrected literally, how do we treat that body then in our lifetime? Do we desecrate it, or and so how does that go? So I just want to throw that in at the end. Okay, Dean Clement, I think I'm done. That's it. So I hope, again, I tried to do too much tonight. I apologize for that in advance. I think I'm going to stop sharing the screen if you don't mind. I will stop sharing. I think I tried to do too much, but nonetheless,
Well, I
we
would
got it.
say you did too much because you had your 18 slides and you got through your 18 slides. So
Yeah, I got through them.
you got through them. So I mean,
Dean Clement, fewer pictures. Pictures, slow it down.
Maybe that's what it was, but you got your 18
got it.
slides and you got through it all. So,
thank you.
Attendees, what questions would we have for Dr. Gale after his very informative presentation? We can use the Q&A to just type your questions in. We will read the questions and Dr. Gale will respond to them. So, okay.
Someone's hand is up.
Someone's hand is raised. You're not going to be able to talk, but if you can just put it in the Q&A, we can definitely read it and we can get you answered. Let's see here. So while you're waiting here, if we have to talk afterlife, Dr. Gale, what is your of these different religions that you hang on, here's the question. Let's let that. Okay, Andrew, isn't getting tattoos like asking to have your fate read? A lot of scholars will say both are pretty bad, but never really fully outline the consequences. Could you shed some light on this?
I'm not an expert on the theology behind tattoos. I will say that isn't like asking, not necessarily, I don't think. You're not getting your fate read. I mean, if you're getting a tattoo of your child on your chest, I don't know if that's like having, I don't think that's the same thing quite as having your fate read. Yeah, a lot of scholars would say both are not great. The consequences. Well, as far as what I was talking about, the consequences are, it would be considered for Jews, for example, it would be considered desecration of the body. So it might be considered a pretty big deal. What are the consequences? You can undo tattoos, I suppose. You have to make, in any religion, if you do something you're not supposed to do, you have to atone for it. So you have to answer for that tattoo, regardless of whether it is, consult your spiritual advisor or what have you. But there are consequences to an action that's a violation. I mean, you have to face the music. Atonement would be one of those things, and probably talking with your religious leader regarding what it is. It would depend on the religion, depend on the nature, depend on if the tattoo can be reversed. But ideally, if you believe in bodily resurrection, you're kind of supposed to leave the body intact as much as it is. But I'm not sure if a tattoo's, it could be like asking to have your fate read, but I wouldn't equate the two.
Okay, good answer. Next question here. Do you think that for other living beings, not humans, like dogs and cats, move on to another life?
I hope so, Natalie. I want to see my dogs. I mean, I know it's a naive sort of thing, but I still miss my dog and I still miss animals a lot. I hope so. I would like to believe that. And in some religions, Judaism, it depends upon your denomination, but animals have souls. Animals have souls. I know there's a debate about that in some religions, but I do hope that other living beings do have souls. They are important. I know, I personally would like to believe that as well. And I do hope they move on to another life. Some Jewish traditions even say, in fact, that animals have higher souls than human beings. I'm not going to go into that so much, but there is a thread of tradition that says that even the soul of animals, it's even like can be operating on a higher plane than humankind.
Okay, nice. Is there something wrong with piercings?
Depends on your perspective. You could say it's permanent, but on the other hand, again, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not, a religious authority on Islam or Christianity or Judaism. I'm a historian. Is there something wrong with piercings? There are some in different religions that will not get piercings for that reason, that they believe it's a desecration of the body. But I think piercing is fairly normative. And remember, piercing does not necessarily have to be permanent. Piercing can be temporary. The hole can grow back. I know that because I had a pierced ear when I was younger. You can still see where the hole was, but it's sort of closed up. So I assume if you have a piercing and later on in life you don't use it, I sort of assume that it will close up.
Here's a good one for you. If the Jews and in Islam believe in physical body resurrection, what about those who have physical disabilities or have lost a limb in their lifetime? Would they be brought back as they were, or will they be brought back fully abled and with an intact limb?
Okay, well, let's keep one thing in perspective here. It's a great question. Let's keep one thing in perspective here. The key to salvation is not the body. Let's just make sure. I just want to make sure your soul is immortal. Your body's still relatively a shell. So, in other words, the body really isn't ultimately the key. Yes, if there's bodily resurrection, you will be judged. Ultimately, it will be your immortal soul. In Hebrew, it would be your neshama, your soul. In other languages, that would be in the olam haba. So it's not like we're going to walk anywhere. So the body, now there are a couple different views. Again, I'm not an expert on the theology behind that. There are some strands of thought that say the body will be as God intended it. I think one of the passages from the Quran actually sort of stated that back in the presentation. It's sort of the way God intended it. That's the body that will be resurrected. I don't know if that will be a body with physical disabilities or anything like that. Others say you'll be brought back as you were. Some strands of theory say you'll be brought back you'll be out of pain. I mean, let's take the example of both my parents died of cancer. So if my parents are resurrected, are they going to go back, like 10 minutes before they died in agony with cancer? I hope not. I hope that they come back the way that they come back in their prime, so to speak, or at least brought back as God would intend them. But again, here's one of the confounding variables. That's not a duck. It's a confounding variable. Is as one of my teachers said, what will actually happen when the Messiah comes at the end times? Whether you're Jew, you're Christian, you're Muslim, whatever. Short answer is we don't know. I don't know the answer. If you're Jew, Christian, or Muslim, Allah, God, in Judaism, Hashem, whatever name you have for God, they will ultimately make that decision. I don't know if I can determine, or any religious expert can firmly determine exactly what's going to happen at the end time. That might ultimately be up to God, but I don't have a firm answer for that.
Okay. How important was it in each of these religious groups for the individual to fit in?
How important was it in each of these religious groups? Jason, can you maybe clarify that for me? And maybe you're just talking about is individual judgment important? It is. How important was it in each of I'm not sure if you mean to fit in with the group or fit in with the concept of afterlife. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, individual judgment is something, as we learned tonight, that is important. Sorry for being a little nebulous, but yes, fit in with the group. It's not a necessity. It's not a requirement. Let's face it. Let's take the Judeo-Christian world. Jesus wasn't all that popular in his day. I mean, a lot of people didn't like him. The Hebrew prophets oftentimes had a very lonely. The prophet Jeremiah in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, the prophet Jeremiah has a miserable life. God even tells him, don't bother to get married. Your life's going to be miserable. And he's known as one of the greatest prophets of all time. So no, I'm not sure if you have to fit in with the group. Once individual judgment comes into play, it's more a lot about how you live your life. Now, how you treat others is also important as well. But I haven't done a lot of research into social groups and does the individual have to fit in with the group? My answer would be no, not necessarily. What if your group is bad? What if their behavior is bad? They're doing bad things. and you want to change the system, and you want to go your own way to be a better person, you should buck the group and go and be a better person. Buck the trend and be on your own. So I don't think it's an absolute prerequisite here, requisite, Jason.
Okay. Question here. This is Marla. I'm sorry I got here a bit late, so I
Hi,
don't know if you
Marla.
covered this already. I was wondering if you touched on near-death experiences and what we can garner from those experiences and stories about the afterlife.
Well, certainly, Marla, we can gain a lot from stories about the afterlife, depending on where they come from, too. I mean, the rabbis, for example, in Judaism, talk about the afterlife, and things like that. So we definitely can learn quite a bit. I did not touch on near-death experiences, Marla. That's a little bit out of my realm, but we certainly can garner things from near-death experiences. I think it's really fascinating research, especially me coming, my first degree is a science degree in psychology. So that's, of course, very fascinating to me personally. But we can learn a lot about that. But the distinction I would make here is, as far as near-death experiences goes in certain religions, we shouldn't confuse that with a death. Maybe we should be careful that we distinguish that from a death experience. Near-death experience versus a death experience. Most religions believe, let's face it, that when your time to go comes, you're going to go. If you have a near-death experience and you live, an argument can be made that it probably really wasn't your time to go. I know that's controversial, but certainly near-death experiences are fascinating, and certainly stories about the afterlife are really important. My father couldn't come up with, my father just said no one's ever come back to tell us. But there are lots of rich legends in Islam, in Judaism, and Christianity about stories about the afterlife and what we can learn from the afterlife. Certainly, they're important. They teach us, if nothing else, stories about the afterlife can teach us how to live our lives better, and prepare ourselves for the afterlife better. It's a great question.
Okay. How would we know when God comes back versus someone trying to say they are God?
That's a great question, Sharon. I don't know. This is not meant to be a joke. This is not meant to be facetious, but the extra credit in my course, sometimes I tell students, if they want extra credit in my class, bring in a tape recording of God. If you want extra credit, bring me a tape recording of God. How do I know it's God? How do I know if it's not? I've had students, bring in leaves and say every nature comes from God, bring in music and say music was inspired by God. No, I want a tape recording of God. How do I know I'm getting a tape recording of God? How do I know it's legit? Let me say this, in 24 years at WVU, no one's ever gotten that extra credit yet. How do we know when God comes back? We'll have to be convinced. It will have to be, there's false prophets. A lot of religions have a history, for example, of false prophets. People coming back saying, hey, I'm a prophet. Everybody needs to listen to me. And they're 99.9999% of the time, they're false. There'll have to be certain signs of the end times. Most religions have certain signs that will happen leading up to the end times. We'll kind of know when it's coming. But when the end times or when God comes back, it's got to be definitive. Exactly what will happen, as I said a few minutes ago, we don't know. I can't for sure say exactly what will happen, but it better be convincing. So in my tape recording example, no one's ever brought me in a tape recording of God that can definitively prove it's God. And as I always tell my students, no one's gotten this in 24 years. And if you do, and you can convince me, and it is legitimately a tape recording of God, I will likely give you an A in the course, because I will most certainly be pretty terrified of you, and I'm not going to mess with you. So, I always, facetiously say that back, but it's a great question. We're not sure, but it has to be convincing. There have to be certain fulfillments, certain signs fulfilled.
All right. Not a question, just to say thank you. You certainly made me think, and I learned a lot from this short time with you. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jason. Thank you for participating.
So we got a couple more minutes here. I'm just going to throw out one question. What are your thoughts on reincarnation and how that figures into afterlife, if it figures in at all?
It depends upon the religion, Dean Clement. It depends. In Hinduism, for example, which we didn't cover tonight, in Hinduism, it's normative. The idea of samsara, the idea of the cycle of rebirth in some religions like Hinduism, it's normative. Hindus believe that when you die, your soul will have to go and serve its time and be purged of its sins, just kind of like we learned tonight. And then your soul will basically inhabit another body, and you'll go through many cycles of rebirth until you kind of finally get it right. The goal in most religions, let me say this, is not to be reborn over and over. That's not that we think it should be, because we want to live forever and want to constantly keep coming back. But remember what I said earlier. This is not the ideal world. We don't want to keep coming back here. But in religions like Hinduism, they believe that, yeah, you have to keep coming back to this world until you gain wisdom, you get it right, you figure out how to live a selfless life, not a selfish life, et cetera, et cetera. Other religions, reincarnation is sort of a more mystical concept. Even Judaism, for example, leaves the door open. Now, reincarnation is not a normative part in Judaism. We said you die, your soul will eventually make its way to the Olam Haba. But there is a strand, even in Jewish mystical thought primarily, that says if you die before you get a chance to accomplish your life's mission on earth, that God will, there's a chance you will be reincarnated and you will come back again to sort of live another life to fulfill your destiny if it's cut off, before you get a chance. So reincarnation in many religions, it's sort of on the fringe or maybe more mystical thought, but in some particularly Eastern religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, it's normative.
Wow. Okay. Well, Dr. Gale, we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this evening. If anyone has any additional questions for Dr. Gale, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Gale. His email address is aaron.gale@mail.wvu.edu. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you for spending this time with us. Everyone have a good evening. So
thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you again. Hey,
and thanks everybody for attending.
Yep. Hey, can we set up a time to talk about what we can do in the fall?
Sure, Dean Clement. I actually I had an idea before as I was getting ready for this. Oh gosh, what was it? Hang on, give me a minute. I'll think about it. I had an idea. We did witches. It's right before Halloween, right?
Halloween,
so it's sort of a Halloween theme.
Yes, a Halloween something.
Yeah, give me a minute. I had an idea. Oh my God, I was going to tell you it. Hang on, give me a minute.
No, it's fine.
I could actually do, if you wanted to do something very direct, I could even do like a history of where Halloween came from.
Oh, that would be good.
History of, I know the History Channel used to have a special called The Haunted History of Halloween. So I was thinking we could maybe do the Haunted History of Halloween or something and have kind of a Halloween theme. Does that sound cool?
That sounds way cool to me. I mean, I think we did what we did last year with the Halloween was pretty informative as well, and I think kids would like that. So, Haunted History of Halloween.
The Haunted History of Halloween.
Okay.
It's stealing from the History Channel, but I don't think they're going to sue us.
No, I don't think so either. Well, Aaron, this was awesome. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, and I'm so glad everything went smoothly. We got back on track tonight. I didn't crash. By the way, the computer that blue screened with the presentation in January, subsequently a couple months later, did die.
Oh, okay. So this is not that computer.
No, this is my laptop.
Okay.
And up until this morning, I could not get the camera to work, the integrated camera to work on this laptop. I took it to Robert Phipps in Eberly this morning, and I did not realize this. There's a little switch right by the camera.
Yes, there's a switch. Yep.
And he just turned the switch on. Said, "There you go." I said, "Oh, that's the equivalent of is it plugged in? Do you have it plugged in?" I had no clue that on a laptop there was a switch to.
Yep, and some of those they have them. So
okay, it worked out well tonight.
Well, this is awesome. I appreciate it as always. I think your lectures are very informative. I really enjoyed it as well. So
okay, thanks, Dean Clement. We'll talk soon.
Yes. Have a good evening, Aaron.
Thank you,
everyone.
Dean.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, Damien. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.